It hurts, inside too. The words echoed like a desperate confession in the stillness of that fateful afternoon. When the rancher lifted her dress, what he discovered changed everything in ways neither could have imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Melia Hart curled her body around her swollen belly, the thin blanket doing little to ward off the chill that seeped through the stone walls. 6 months pregnant, she no longer carried hope within her, only evidence of depravity. Her father, Jeremiah Hart, once a respected rancher in Escalante, had fallen prey to the poisonous words of a self-proclaimed desert prophet. The man who had taught her to ride horses and count stars now saw her as nothing more than a vessel for his twisted salvation. "The child will bring rain," he'd whispered the night he came to her room, eyes vacant with madness. "My blood, my seed, pure sacrifice to heal our dying land." The young woman traced the outline of her stomach in the darkness, feeling the child shift beneath her fingertips. Not a baby born of love, but the living proof of Jeremiah's descent into darkness. Each kick was a reminder of what she'd lost and what she fought to protect. Cold stone pressed against her back as she listened to the night sounds of the compound. The makeshift prison that had once been a storage cellar offered no comfort, just 4 walls, a dirt floor, and a small window too high and narrow for escape. Outside, the vast Utah desert stretched endlessly, Monument Valley's towering sandstone formations standing like silent sentinels, indifferent to her suffering. Every morning, women from her father's growing cult would come with buckets and brushes. They'd scrub the floors where Melia had been sick, wipe away her tears from the walls, all without meeting her eyes. Their methodical cleaning seemed to suggest that pain could be washed away like dirt, that suffering left no permanent stain. "Please," she had begged during those first weeks, "help me, this isn't right." But their expressions remained blank, their hands never pausing in their work. Whatever humanity they once possessed had been scrubbed away by Jeremiah's promises of salvation. Now, in her 6th month of captivity, Melia no longer wasted breath on pleas. Her prayers had simplified to a single word: escape. Even knowing what waited beyond, the merciless sun, the jagged cliffs, the miles of empty desert, she yearned for it. Death in the wilderness seemed kinder than the fate her father had planned for her and her unborn child when the time came. She pressed her forehead against the cool stone and closed her eyes. The ritual would be soon. She'd overheard the whispers. Melia placed both hands protectively over her belly and made a silent promise to the child within. Somehow, before the moon completed its cycle, they would flee this nightmare or die trying. The guards were slumped against the wooden fence, their empty bottles scattered around them like fallen soldiers. Melia Hart had watched them for hours through the crack in her makeshift cell, counting the drinks, waiting for their eyes to glaze over. This was her moment, perhaps her only chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slipped through the unlocked door. The torn, filthy dress clung to her body, the fabric rough against her skin. 6 months of captivity had left her weak, but desperation fueled each painful step. Every movement sent waves of agony through her swollen belly, the unborn child inside shifting restlessly as if sensing their escape. The cold Utah night air hit her face like a blessing after months in that stifling room. Monument Valley stretched before her, its massive sandstone formations looming like silent sentinels in the moonlight. Melia limped barefoot over jagged rocks, wincing as sharp edges cut into her tender feet, leaving tiny trails of blood in the dust. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself and the child she carried. "Just keep moving." In the distance, desert dogs began to bark. They'd caught her scent. Worse still, flickering torches appeared behind her, bobbing like fireflies against the darkness. Her father's followers were awake. They were coming. The thought of Jeremiah Hart finding her sent a fresh surge of terror through her body. She remembered his eyes, once kind, now hollow with madness as he spoke of prophecies and blood sacrifices. Her hand instinctively moved to the crude symbol carved into her belly, his mark of ownership. Melia pushed herself harder, her bare feet numb now from cold and pain. The pregnant woman's breath came in ragged gasps that tore at her dry throat. She stumbled over a rock and nearly fell, catching herself at the last moment. The baby kicked violently, as if protesting the rough treatment. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, one hand cradling her belly. "I'm so sorry." The voices behind her grew louder, the torches brighter. Melia forced herself forward until her vision began to blur, white spots dancing before her eyes. Her legs finally gave out as she reached the edge of an unfamiliar ranch. The wooden fence posts swam in her vision as she collapsed against them, her fingers digging into the dirt. With the last of her strength, Melia curled protectively around her belly, clutching it in a desperate attempt to shield her unborn child from more harm. As consciousness slipped away, she prayed that whoever owned this land would find her before her father did. As Melia lay trembling in the dust, the night pressed in with suffocating silence. The vastness of the Utah desert seemed to swallow her whole as she curled against the wooden fence post, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. Blood had dried in dark patches along her thighs, and each shallow breath sent waves of pain through her battered body. The moon cast long shadows across the barren landscape, transforming familiar shapes into monstrous silhouettes that reminded her too much of the cult compound she'd fled. Then came the sound of hooves, heavy, deliberate, and close. The rhythmic thudding grew louder, sending tremors through the ground beneath her cheek. Melia's heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to make herself smaller, invisible against the earth. Had her father's men found her already? She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, tasting copper as fresh blood welled. A lone figure appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the star-speckled sky. The rider approached slowly, the horse's breath visible in the cool night air. Melia squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for rough hands and cruel words. But the footsteps that approached after the rider dismounted were measured, cautious. William Souza stood motionless for a long moment, squinting through the darkness at the crumpled form by his fence. The rancher was a man of few words. His weathered face, a map of solitude etched by 10 years of speaking more to the land than to any living soul since burying his wife. His calloused hands hung at his sides, uncertain, as he took in the scene before him. "Miss?" His voice cracked from disuse, barely audible above the desert wind. When she didn't respond, he knelt slowly, keeping a respectful distance. The moonlight revealed more details. Her torn dress, bare feet rubbed raw from running, and the unmistakable curve of pregnancy. William had delivered countless calves and foals on his ranch, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of this young woman in agony. Blood staining her thighs, crumpled by his fence like something discarded. "I won't hurt you," he murmured, reaching out with hesitant fingers that stopped short of touching her shoulder. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely howl echoing across the Monument Valley. The sound seemed to draw Melia back to consciousness, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. "Help," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of everything she'd endured. "Please." Melia Hart's hair was matted against her tear-stained face, clinging to her skin in dark, wet strands. Each breath she took came as a ragged gasp, her chest heaving with the effort. William knelt beside her, the desert dust coating his worn jeans. His weathered hands, calloused from years of ranch work, moved with unexpected gentleness as they brushed aside the shredded fabric of her dress to locate the source of the blood. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low and steady despite the alarm rising within him. "I need to see where you're hurt." As the tattered cloth fell away, William froze. His breath caught in his throat, and for several heartbeats, he couldn't move. There, carved into the pale curve of her swollen belly, was a symbol, crude, deliberate, and unmistakably ritualistic. The cuts were deep, the edges inflamed and weeping, forming a pattern he'd never seen before, but instantly recognized as something born of madness. The rancher had seen his share of brutality in his years. He'd branded cattle, witnessed the harsh realities of desert life, even buried his wife after illness took her far too young. But this deliberate marking of a pregnant young woman struck him with a horror that felt physical, like a bullet to his chest. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Melia's eyes, glassy with pain and fear, met his briefly before darting away to scan the empty horizon behind him. Her fingers clutched weakly at his wrist. "Please," she managed through cracked lips. "He'll find me." William noticed how young she was, barely more than a girl herself, yet carrying a child. The symbol carved into her flesh seemed to pulse in the moonlight, a declaration of ownership that made his stomach turn. He'd heard whispers in Escalante about strange happenings, about Jeremiah Hart's descent into something dark after the drought had stretched on too long. But he'd dismissed them as small-town talk. Now, with the evidence before him, William understood he was looking at something far worse than he'd imagined. This wasn't just cruelty, it was ritual. Someone had marked this child-bearer as a sacrifice of some kind. "Can you stand?" he asked, already knowing the answer as her eyelids fluttered. The young woman's only response was a soft moan as consciousness began to slip away from her. William made his decision in that moment. Whatever darkness had marked her, whatever evil pursued her across the Utah desert, it would have to come through him first. Melia Hart's voice was barely a whisper, but the words cut deeper than any knife. "It hurts inside too," she choked out, her eyes flickering between terror and hope. The moonlight caught the tears streaming down her dirt-smudged face, each drop carrying months of unspeakable pain. William knelt beside her, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over her trembling form. The carved symbol on her belly spoke of madness he couldn't comprehend, a father marking his own child like livestock. But her words suggested wounds far beyond what his eyes could see. "I'm going to help you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The rancher hadn't spoken this gently to another soul since burying his wife years ago. "Can you tell me your name?" "Melia," she whispered, clutching her swollen belly protectively. "Please, he'll come for me." Her eyes darted toward the vast darkness of Monument Valley, stretching behind them, as if Jeremiah might materialize from the shadows at any moment. Without hesitation, William gathered her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, despite being 6 months pregnant. Her body felt fragile, like a wounded bird, and he could feel her heart racing against his chest. The young woman winced as he lifted her, fresh blood seeping through her tattered dress. "I've got you now," he murmured, adjusting his grip to cause her less pain. "My cabin's just over that rise." The silence of the desert was thick around them, broken only by Melia's ragged breathing and the occasional distant howl of coyotes. William's eyes scanned the horizon as he carried her toward safety. Out here, sound traveled for miles. A gunshot, a scream, even the whinny of a horse could shatter this momentary peace. His mind raced with questions. What kind of father would hunt his own daughter? What kind of madness had consumed Jeremiah Hart? William had heard whispers about the man, once respected in Escalante, now rumored to have fallen in with strange beliefs after the drought claimed his cattle. Melia's fingers suddenly clutched his shirt. "He believes the baby is special," she whispered, as if reading his thoughts, "that its blood will bring rain." William's jaw tightened. He'd seen desperation drive men to terrible things, but this was beyond comprehension. As the cabin came into view, he made a silent promise to the broken girl in his arms. No one would hurt her again. Not while he drew breath. The desert night pressed in around them, vast and unforgiving. But William knew the real danger wasn't the wilderness. It was the man who would surely come searching for what he believed was rightfully his. William Sousa's cabin was humble but sturdy, a testament to the rancher's practical nature. Inside, the wooden beams creaked as he carefully laid Melia Hart on his only bed, the springs protesting beneath her slight weight. The single room smelled of pine and wood smoke, with just enough space for essential living. "Stay with me," William whispered, his weathered face creased with concern as he assessed her condition. Melia's skin had taken on an alarming pallor, clammy to the touch. Her cracked lips barely moved as shallow breaths escaped them. For a terrifying moment, the rancher feared she might slip away right before his eyes, another soul lost to the merciless desert. He moved with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands were calloused from years of ranch work. William retrieved his canteen and dampened a clean cloth, carefully bringing it to her parched lips. Melia's eyes fluttered at the touch of moisture, a faint sign of life that gave him hope. "Small sips," he instructed, supporting her head with one hand. The young woman managed to swallow a little water, each drop seeming to breathe life back into her fragile form. William gathered his limited medical supplies, alcohol, clean cloths, and bandages he kept for ranch injuries. With methodical care, he began cleaning the dirt and dried blood from her wounds. Each time his cloth revealed another bruise or cut, his jaw tightened with barely contained anger. When he reached the carved symbol on her belly, his hands trembled. The crude mark had been etched with deliberate cruelty, the skin around it inflamed and tender. William had seen many things in his years: cattle mutilations, hunting accidents, even the aftermath of bar fights, but nothing had prepared him for such calculated malice. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though Melia had drifted into unconsciousness. He applied a salve to the wounds before wrapping her midsection with strips of clean cloth torn from one of his shirts. As night deepened, William sat beside the bed, rifle propped against the wall within reach. The fire in the stone hearth cast dancing shadows across the cabin's interior. His mind kept returning to Jeremiah Hart, a man he'd known, nodded to at cattle auctions, even shared drinks with years ago. How could someone fall so far? The carved symbol seemed to burn in his memory, a terrible reminder that evil often wore a familiar face. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls. William added another log to the fire and settled back in his chair for the long vigil ahead. Whatever came next, he wouldn't let her face it alone. Even in her fevered sleep, Melia's hand grasped William's wrist with desperate strength, as if she were drowning in the depths of her nightmares. Her fingers left white marks on his weathered skin, a silent plea not to be abandoned again. William Sousa remained by her side through the night, watching the flicker of terror cross her face as she battled demons in her dreams. When Melia Hart finally awoke, her eyes brimmed with that familiar fear. But William noticed something else there too, the tiniest ember of hope, fragile but unmistakable. She studied his face in the soft morning light filtering through the cabin's single window, as if trying to determine whether his kindness was genuine or merely another cruel deception. "Water?" he offered, his voice rough from disuse. The young woman nodded weakly, wincing as she shifted her swollen belly. After several cautious sips, Melia's confession spilled out in a broken, ashamed whisper. "My father did this. Jeremiah Hart." Her hand trembled as she traced the outline of the ritual mark beneath her bandages. William froze, the name striking a chord of dread inside him. The cup in his hand nearly slipped to the floor. Everyone in Escalante knew Jeremiah, a once respected rancher who had tipped over the edge of sanity after 3 years of devastating drought. "I know him," William admitted, his jaw tightening. "Used to trade cattle with him at the market." Melia's eyes widened. "Then you know what he's become." William nodded grimly. The rumors had spread through the valley like wildfire. Jeremiah's obsession with an itinerant desert prophet, the strange gatherings at his property, the women who came and never left. Some said he'd found salvation. Others whispered of blood sacrifices and midnight rituals to appease forgotten gods. "He believes the child will bring rain," Melia continued, her voice hollow. "His blood, his seed." She turned away, shame coloring her cheeks. The prophet told him only the purest sacrifice would end the drought. William's calloused hand hovered uncertainly before gently covering hers. The rancher had spent years in solitude after burying his wife, speaking more to the land than to any living soul. Now, faced with this broken young woman, words failed him completely. "You're safe here," he finally managed, the promise hanging between them like a fragile thread. Melia's eyes met his, searching for deception, but finding only determined resolve. Her fingers tightened around his, and for the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might come after all. William slumped into his wooden chair, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he tried to process Melia's words. The Jeremiah Hart he remembered from the Escalante cattle market had been a boisterous man with a firm handshake and shrewd business sense, respected throughout Monument Valley for his knowledge of the land. That man bore no resemblance to the monster the young woman described. "I've known your father for years," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He used to bring the finest cattle in Utah to market." Melia's eyes hardened, her fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of the symbol carved into her swollen belly. "That man is gone," she replied, her voice steady despite her weakened state. "The drought changed him. He started listening to some wandering prophet who promised rain if the right sacrifices were made." William leaned forward, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. "What kind of sacrifices?" "At first, it was animals," Melia continued, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Then he said the land needed more. That's when the women started coming to the ranch, followers who believed every word he said." She paused, swallowing hard. "He said my child would be pure, his seed, his blood. The ritual would bring rain." A bitter, ragged laugh escaped her cracked lips, startling William with its hollow sound. He gave up his soul for a storm that never came. The rancher sat back, stunned into silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney as the weight of her confession settled between them. Outside, the vast Utah desert stretched endlessly under starlight, as dry as it had been for 3 years running. "The women held me down," Melia whispered. "They sang while he—" Her voice trailed off, but her eyes told William everything he couldn't bear to hear. William's fists clenched involuntarily. He had seen desperate men do terrible things during droughts before, shooting neighbors over water rights, stealing cattle, even burning rival ranches. But this was something else entirely. This was madness clothed in faith. "You're not just running from a bad home," he said finally, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're running from a cult." Melia nodded, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "And they won't stop looking for me." In his mind, this child belongs to the land, to the ritual. William Souza stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. He had come to this isolated ranch to escape his own ghosts after burying his wife. Now, fate had delivered someone else's nightmare to his doorstep. Melia Hart was no ordinary runaway. She was the key to a ritual that had consumed her father's sanity. And somewhere out in the darkness, Jeremiah was hunting. William stared at Melia Hart's trembling hands as she clutched the worn blanket around her shoulders. This wasn't just any runaway seeking shelter from the elements. This was a daughter hunted by her own flesh and blood, carrying a child conceived in violence and marked by madness. The carved symbol on her belly told a story more horrific than any William had encountered in his decades roaming the harsh Utah landscape. "He'll never stop," Melia whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "My father believes this child is the key to ending the drought." William nodded slowly, the firelight casting deep shadows across his weathered face. In her eyes, despite everything Jeremiah had done to her, he recognized something that had abandoned his soul years ago when he buried his wife: purpose. The young woman's determination to protect her unborn child stirred something primal within him. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue after years of speaking mainly to his livestock and the empty walls of his cabin. Melia reached out, her fingers wrapping around his calloused hand with surprising strength. The simple human contact made his breath catch. How long had it been since anyone had touched him with such trust? "I won't surrender," she said, a spark of defiance flashing through her exhaustion. "Not to him, not to his prophecies, not to anyone." The rancher nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The small cabin near Escalante felt suddenly smaller, more vulnerable. The silence outside was deceptive, a false peace that would inevitably shatter. The Monument Valley stretched endlessly beyond his property, offering both escape and exposure. William rose and added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. The warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in his bones. If Jeremiah truly believed his daughter's child was meant for some twisted ritual to bring rain to parched lands, the man wouldn't simply give up and move on. "Someone will come," William said, moving to check that his rifle was loaded and within reach. "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow." "I know," Melia replied, her hand instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. "He thinks the blood of his blood will save everything." William looked out the small window at the vast darkness. The quiet was oppressive, like the moment before a storm breaks. He had known Jeremiah years ago, had shaken his hand at cattle auctions, had even shared drinks once or twice. The thought that the same man was now hunting his pregnant daughter made his stomach turn. "Then we'll be ready," he said, his decision made. Whatever came knocking, William Souza would stand between Melia and the madness that pursued her. The night outside was eerily still, the kind of silence that made every instinct scream in warning. William Souza sat watch by the fire, his rifle within arm's reach, the weight of it a cold comfort against the darkness pressing in from all sides. The flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as he replayed Melia's words over and over in his mind. Each revelation more disturbing than the last. Through the window, Monument Valley stretched vast and unforgiving, bathed in moonlight that turned the sandstone formations into looming sentinels. The rancher's weathered hands trembled slightly as he stoked the fire, not from fear but from a rage he hadn't felt since burying his wife years ago. He remembered shaking Jeremiah Hart's hand at the Escalante cattle market, back when the man was still respected among the ranchers of Utah. William could still hear his booming laugh echoing across the auction yard, see the pride in his eyes when he spoke of his daughter. How could that same man now hunt Melia like she was nothing more than livestock? How could a father carve ritualistic symbols into his own child's flesh, all for some twisted prophecy about rain? Avuto took a long drink of water, his throat dry from the night watch. Inside the bedroom, Melia slept fitfully, her pregnant form curled protectively around her unborn child. Even in sleep, her face carried the marks of her ordeal. Not just the physical wounds, but something deeper, a hurt that went beyond flesh. "It hurts inside, too," she had whispered earlier. Those words haunted William more than any ghost story told around campfires. His jaw tightened as he rose to check the locks again. The cabin wasn't built for defense, just a simple rancher's home meant for quiet solitude, not for harboring fugitives from madmen. William ran his calloused fingers along the wooden doorframe, calculating how long it would hold against determined intruders. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing with it the distant sound of hooves striking hard-packed desert soil. William's head snapped up, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He extinguished the lamp with a quick breath, plunging the main room into darkness, save for the dying embers in the fireplace. In one fluid motion, he grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, staying to the side to avoid being silhouetted. The moonlight caught the outline of a lone rider approaching from the east, the figure's posture rigid and purposeful. William checked his ammunition, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knew this moment would come. Jeremiah wouldn't simply let his daughter escape, not when he believed her child was the key to some twisted salvation. The distant thunder of hooves broke the fragile silence of the night. William Souza set his coffee mug down and reached for his rifle, the worn wooden stock familiar against his palm. He moved to the window, peering through the darkness at the approaching figure, a lone rider silhouetted against the moonlit desert. "Stay inside," he whispered to Melia, who nodded weakly from the bed, her hands instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. The rancher stepped onto the porch, keeping to the shadows. His rifle remained steady despite the hammering in his chest. The horse approaching was skittish, pawing at the ground as its rider pulled to a stop 20 yards from the cabin. The stranger's posture was rigid, purposeful, a man on a mission. "Evening," William called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You're a long way from anywhere." The rider dismounted with practiced ease. His face remained partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but William could see the cold determination in his eyes. This was no lost traveler. "I know she's here," the man said, his voice flat and emotionless. "The girl, Jeremiah Hart's daughter." William's finger hovered near the trigger. "Don't know what you're talking about." The stranger took a step forward, moonlight revealing a weathered face and the glint of a weapon at his hip. "Let's not play games, Souza. She belongs to us. Hand her over and no blood has to be spilled tonight." Inside the cabin, Melia pressed her ear against the door, trembling as she recognized the voice. One of her father's devoted followers, a man who had watched impassively during the rituals. William's grip on the rifle tightened, his stance widening slightly. "Not a chance," he replied, his voice hardening with each word. "Turn around and ride back to Jeremiah. Tell him his daughter isn't property." The messenger's mouth twisted into a knowing smirk. "He said you'd be difficult. Said you always were stubborn, even back when you two used to trade at the cattle market." He adjusted his hat. "This isn't about you. It's bigger than all of us. That child she carries is hers," William interrupted. "Nothing more." The man studied William for a long moment, then nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "You've made your choice." He returned to his horse, mounting with deliberate slowness. "This ain't over. Not by a long shot." As the rider turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness, William remained on the porch, rifle ready, until the hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he allow his shoulders to slump, the weight of what was coming settling over him like a shroud. The rider's lips curled into a knowing smirk, his eyes reflecting the cold calculation of a man who had expected this resistance. He adjusted his hat, the shadow falling across his weathered face as he surveyed William's stance, defiant, unwavering, with the rifle held steady in his calloused hands. "This ain't over," he warned, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Jeremiah Hart wants what belongs to him. You'd be wise not to stand in his way." With practiced ease, he turned his horse, the animal pivoting in the dust. William remained motionless, watching as the rider disappeared into the vastness of the Utah desert. The thunder of hooves gradually faded into silence, but the threat hung in the air like the scent before a storm, heavy, ominous, inevitable. Inside the cabin, Melia clutched her swollen belly protectively, her face drained of color. The thin cotton dress William had found for her did little to hide her trembling. She sat on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the doorway as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "He'll tell my father where I am," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "That was one of his men. I recognize him from the compound." William set his rifle against the wall, but kept it within reach. He moved to the window, scanning the horizon where dust still lingered from the departing horsemen. "We have time," he said, though uncertainty edged his words. "Not much, but some." Nolia's fingers traced the outline of the carved symbol beneath her dress, a subconscious gesture that made William's jaw tighten. The rancher had seen many things in his years of solitude, but nothing had prepared him for the horrors this young woman carried, both on her skin and in her heart. "Next time, they won't send just one man," she said, meeting William's gaze with frightening clarity. "My father believes this child is the key to his salvation. He'll bring everyone, all his followers." William nodded grimly, understanding the weight of what lay ahead. He'd known from the moment he found Melia by his fence that helping her would have consequences. But seeing her now, this broken yet determined young woman, fighting for her unborn child, he knew he couldn't turn back. "Then we'll be ready," he said simply, moving to secure the cabin's windows and doors. They both understood the truth without needing to speak it aloud. This was only the beginning. Jeremiah Hart would come for his daughter, and when he did, blood would stain the desert sand before dawn. The ranch settled into an uneasy rhythm over the next few days. William Souza moved about his property with deliberate caution, his weathered eyes constantly scanning the horizon while his rifle never strayed far from reach. He reinforced the cabin's windows with spare lumber, creating makeshift barriers that might buy precious seconds if trouble came. Inside, Melia Hart spent her days resting on William's only bed, her swollen belly a constant reminder of what was at stake. The carved symbol had begun to scab over, but the psychological wounds remained raw. At night, she would jolt awake, her fingers clutching at the clean sheets as if they might turn to desert sand beneath her. "Do you think he'll come?" she asked one evening as William changed the bandages around her middle. The rancher's hands never faltered in their gentle work. "Yes," he answered simply. No point in sugarcoating what they both knew was inevitable. They established small routines. William would bring water from the well at sunrise. Melia would fold laundry when her strength allowed. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew comfortable rather than strained. The viudo prepared simple meals of beans and cornbread, foods that would help her regain her strength without taxing her traumatized body. On the fourth morning, William woke before the sun touched the horizon. Something had pulled him from sleep. Not a sound, but the absence of one. The desert's night creatures had gone silent. He reached for his rifle and moved to the window, his breath fogging the glass in the pre-dawn chill. There, emerging from the purple shadows of early morning, came 3 riders. Their silhouettes grew more defined as they approached. 3 men on horseback, moving with purpose toward the ranch house. William's jaw tightened as he recognized the center figure, even at this distance. The set of those shoulders, the way he sat tall in the saddle, Jeremiah Hart had come for his daughter. The rancher glanced back at Melia, still asleep, one hand protectively curved over her belly. He wouldn't wake her yet. Let her have these last moments of peace. William stepped onto the porch, rifle held low but ready. The approaching riders slowed, spreading out slightly as they neared the fence line. The morning light caught Jeremiah's face, revealing features twisted by conflicting emotions. The grief of a father and the madness of a zealot battled for control behind those hollow eyes. William planted his feet firmly on the weathered boards of his porch. Whatever happened next would determine all their fates. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as 3 riders approached. William Sousa stood on his porch, rifle steady in his weathered hands. His eyes narrowed against the harsh light. He recognized the center figure immediately. Jeremiah Hart, a man whose face had transformed from that of a respected rancher to something twisted by obsession. Flanked by two rough-looking gunmen, Jeremiah dismounted with deliberate slowness. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he strode forward, stopping at a distance that felt both too close and impossibly far. The yard between them seemed to shrink with tension. "She's mine," Jeremiah growled, his voice raw with emotion and madness. The words hung in the air like poison. "That girl belongs to me." William's stance didn't waver. His reply came cold and certain as steel. "She is no one's property." The hired guns exchanged glances, their hands hovering near their holsters. William could read their intentions clearly. Men paid to do whatever Jeremiah commanded, with no stake in this beyond their payment. "A father has rights," Jeremiah continued, his eyes darting toward the cabin where Melia rested. "What happens in my family is my business alone. Not when it involves carving symbols into your daughter's flesh," William replied, his voice barely containing his disgust. "Not when it means forcing your own child to carry." But before he could finish, one of Jeremiah's men made his move. The gunman's hand flashed to his weapon, drawing with practiced speed. The crack of gunfire shattered the morning stillness, the bullet splintering wood inches from William's head. Time seemed to slow. William could smell gunpowder in the air, feel the vibration of the shot through the porch boards beneath his feet. He saw Jeremiah's face, not triumphant, but conflicted, as if part of him hadn't wanted this violence to erupt. The second gunman was already reaching for his weapon. Behind William, he heard movement inside the cabin, Melia's frightened gasp. The rancher's finger tightened on the trigger of his rifle, knowing that what happened in the next few seconds would determine whether Melia Hart would ever know peace again. Jeremiah's eyes locked with William's. In them, the rancher saw something unexpected, a flicker of the man who once was, drowning in the madness that had consumed him. But that glimpse of humanity wasn't enough to stop what had already been set in motion. William dropped to the ground as the first shot cracked through the morning air. Dust kicked up around him as he rolled behind a weathered water trough, his rifle already at his shoulder. His years of solitude had honed his instincts. Survival wasn't a choice but a reflex. The rancher squeezed the trigger with practiced calm. The first of Jeremiah Hart's men crumpled without a sound, his body folding into the dirt like a marionette with cut strings. The second gunman charged forward with reckless determination, firing wildly. William steadied his breathing, waited for the man to expose himself, then squeezed off another shot. The bullet found its mark with devastating precision, and the hired gun stumbled 3 more steps before collapsing face first into the yard. The air grew thick with gun smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Inside the cabin, Melia's terrified scream pierced through the chaos. Her voice seemed to momentarily freeze time, a reminder of what William was fighting for. A sudden, searing pain tore through William's shoulder. He grunted, feeling warm blood immediately soak through his shirt. The bullet had only grazed him, but the wound burned like a hot brand. Gritting his teeth, he pushed the pain aside and kept his rifle trained on the man who had once been his acquaintance at cattle markets. Jeremiah stood alone now, his hired protection lying motionless in the dust. The older man's face contorted with an unsettling mixture of emotions. Terror flickered across his features, not fear of death, but the dawning realization that his twisted prophecy might remain unfulfilled. Rage followed quickly, his weathered face hardening as he stared at the cabin where his daughter had found refuge. "This ain't over," Jeremiah shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The ritual must be completed. William rose slowly to his feet, blood trickling down his arm. He kept his weapon aimed at Jeremiah's chest, finger hovering near the trigger. The Viodo had lived alone for 10 years, speaking more to the desert wind than to people. But in this moment, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Leave now," William commanded, "or join your men." Jeremiah's eyes darted between William's unwavering rifle and the cabin. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. The madness that had consumed him seemed to recede just enough for him to recognize the precariousness of his position. His hands trembled slightly as he realized this day would not end with his daughter's return. The gunshots echoed across the ranch, each blast shattering the morning stillness. Blood soaked William's shirt, where the bullet had grazed his shoulder, but his aim remained steady, rifle trained on Jeremiah Hart's chest. The rancher's finger tensed on the trigger, his weathered face set with grim determination. Then came a sound that froze them both. "Please don't kill him," Melia cried, her voice breaking as she stumbled onto the wooden porch. Her swollen belly protruded beneath the tattered dress, hands protectively cradling her unborn child. "He's still my father." William's eyes darted between father and daughter, his finger hovering over the trigger. The weight of the rifle suddenly felt unbearable in his hands. He saw the plea in Melia's eyes, not just fear, but something deeper. Despite everything Jeremiah had done, some fragment of love remained buried beneath her trauma. "Get back inside," William urged, his voice low and strained. The wound in his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood trickling down his arm. "He doesn't deserve your mercy." Jeremiah stood motionless in the dust, his hired guns dead around him. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. His eyes, the same shade as his daughter's, flickered with conflicting emotions. Rage battled with grief, madness with clarity. The rancher-turned-cultist seemed momentarily lost, as if waking from a trance to find himself standing in blood. "Melia," Jeremiah whispered, the name sounding foreign on his lips. For just one heartbeat, he looked at his daughter as if truly seeing her, not as a vessel for his twisted prophecy, but as his child. His gaze fell to her belly, to the place where he knew his mark had been carved, and something like regret passed over his features. William watched this transformation with wary eyes, his rifle still aimed. He'd seen men like this before, men who could switch between cruelty and tenderness in an instant. The Vuvo had lived alone too long not to recognize the dangerous unpredictability of a broken mind. Melia took another step forward, her bare feet leaving imprints in the dust of the porch. "Father," she said, the word both an accusation and a plea. The moment hung between them, father, daughter, and protector, suspended in the Utah morning light. The vast Monument Valley stretched behind them, indifferent to their human drama. William's finger remained on the trigger, but he no longer felt certain about pulling it. In Jeremiah's eyes, something shifted. Whether it was a glimpse of the man he once was, or merely a tactical retreat, William couldn't tell. But in that moment of hesitation lay the fate of all 3 lives, and the unborn fourth that Melia carried beneath her heart. The fragile moment of recognition vanished from Jeremiah Hart's weathered face like water on hot desert sand. His eyes, once capable of warmth, hardened into something unrecognizable, the gaze of a man who had wandered too far into darkness to find his way back. "Another girl will take your place," he spat, his voice hollow with conviction. "The ritual must be completed." These weren't the words of the father Melia had once known, but of a stranger wearing his skin. She watched, trembling, as Jeremiah mounted his horse with practiced ease despite his age. The animal snorted and pawed at the ground, sensing the tension in its rider. Without another glance at his daughter or the blood-stained yard, he yanked the reins and galloped away, a diminishing silhouette against the vast emptiness of Monument Valley. The dust settled in his wake, and silence reclaimed the ranch. Melia's legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed to her knees on the porch, her pregnant belly a heavy weight pulling her down. Sobs racked her body, not just for herself or her unborn child, but for the father she had lost long before today. Had she saved him by begging William to spare his life? Or had she merely postponed the nightmare, allowing Jeremiah to find another victim to mark with his twisted faith? "Another girl," she whispered, the words burning her throat. "He's going to hurt someone else." William Sousa pressed his palm against his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers and staining his shirt crimson. His breathing came in controlled, measured intervals despite the pain. The rancher's legs trembled slightly from the aftermath of violence. But his eyes remained clear and determined as he watched the horizon where Jeremiah had disappeared. "We'll warn the sheriff," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "People need to know what he's capable of." He knelt beside Melia, his free hand finding hers. The touch was tentative at first, a man unaccustomed to offering comfort, but grew firmer as she clung to him. "I won't let him hurt you again," William vowed, the words simple but weighted with absolute certainty. "Or your child." Melia looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and dust. In the distance, a desert hawk circled against the endless blue sky. The same sky that had witnessed her escape, her suffering, and now this fragile promise of protection. "I believe you," she whispered, and realized with surprise that she truly did. The desert was silent once more. The only evidence of violence, a few dark stains in the dust. Blood had soaked into the parched earth outside William Sousa's ranch, leaving rusty patches that would soon be erased by wind and time. For the first time in years, Melia Hart felt the grip of terror loosen. She had survived, at least for now. She stood on the porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching the horizon where her father had disappeared. The ritual mark carved into her skin still ached, but differently now, like an old wound finally beginning to heal. No longer did she wake screaming, convinced Jeremiah would be standing over her bed. Days slid into weeks. The ranch gradually became more than a hiding place. It became a home. Melia tended a small garden behind the cabin, coaxing life from the unforgiving Utah soil. Her fingers, once trembling and weak, grew stronger as they worked the earth. Each vegetable that pushed through the ground felt like a small victory against the darkness of her past. William repaired the roof and split wood, always keeping his rifle within reach. His wounded shoulder had healed, leaving another scar to join the collection mapped across his weathered skin. Sometimes, Melia would catch him staring toward Escalante, his jaw tight with worry. They both knew Jeremiah might return, perhaps with more men. Yet between these moments of vigilance, something else grew. They developed quiet routines, breakfast at sunrise, work until the heat became unbearable, then evenings spent in comfortable silence by the fire. The rancher taught her to mend fences and identify which clouds might bring rain. She showed him how to cook meals that weren't just functional, but brought pleasure. One evening, as they sat watching the spectacular reds and purples of a Monument Valley sunset, Melia felt her baby kick with unusual strength. Without thinking, she reached for William's hand and placed it on her belly. The hardened rancher's eyes widened at the sensation of new life pushing against his palm. "She's strong," he said, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "She?" Melia asked, surprised by his certainty. William nodded, a rare smile softening his features. "Just a feeling." That night, Melia slept without nightmares for the first time since her escape. The cabin creaked and settled around her, no longer strange and foreign, but protective and familiar. Outside, William sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, guardian of this fragile peace they'd built from the wreckage of violence and madness. In the gentle rhythm of work and quiet, Something profound began to heal between them. The ranch that had once been merely William Sousa's solitary refuge transformed into a sanctuary for both. Each morning, Melia Hart tended to her small garden, her swollen belly a testament to life persisting despite cruelty. William would watch from the porch, his weathered hands busy repairing tools, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats that might return. The days passed in peaceful routine, Melia cooking simple meals, William splitting wood. They spoke little, but understood much. Their shared trauma had created a language beyond words, a mutual recognition of pain and the slow process of recovery. One night, as the desert wind howled against the cabin walls, Melia's labor began. Her first cry of pain sent William into a panic he hadn't felt since losing his wife. He boiled water, gathered clean cloths, and held her hand as contractions tore through her body. "I can't," she gasped, terror flooding her eyes. What if I'm like him?" William squeezed her hand. "You're nothing like Jeremiah. Nothing." For hours, Melia fought the most difficult battle of her life. The cabin filled with her cries, not of fear this time, but of determination. Just before dawn, when the first light touched the eastern sky, a new voice joined theirs, tiny, fierce, and undeniably alive. A baby girl entered the world, her wail echoing hope through the valley. William cleaned the infant with trembling hands before placing her on Melia's chest. The young mother's tears fell freely as she cradled her daughter, examining perfect fingers and toes with wonder rather than fear. "Esperanza," Melia whispered, looking up at William. "It means hope." The rancher nodded, understanding the weight of such a name. Later, when Melia rested, William cradled Esperanza in his calloused hands. The tiny being, wrapped in a soft blanket he'd purchased weeks earlier from town, stirred something inside him he thought had died with his wife. A warmth, a purpose beyond mere survival. That evening, as desert stars appeared and the baby slept peacefully between them, Melia touched the scar on her belly, now a faded reminder of what she'd endured. "William," she said softly, her voice steady. "Inside doesn't hurt anymore." The rancher looked at her, this brave young woman who had fled through the desert, who had faced her tormentor, who had brought life into a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. And for the first time, he truly believed her. Something had healed in both of them, a wound closing not despite their scars, but because they had survived them together. The scars on Melia's body were healing, but the ones etched into her soul would remain. Each morning, as the Utah sun painted Monument Valley in gold, she would trace the fading mark on her belly while watching Esperanza sleep. Some wounds never truly vanish. They simply become part of who you are. William Sousa noticed how she would sometimes freeze at sudden sounds, the crack of a branch or distant hoofbeats, her eyes darting to the horizon. The rancher understood trauma. He had carried his own ghosts since losing his wife. But in this harsh landscape where most things withered, something unexpected had flourished between them. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Melia asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the baby cradled against her chest. The rancher considered his words carefully. "A man like Jeremiah Hart either finds his way back to sanity or loses himself completely in madness. His weathered hand found hers in the growing darkness. Either way, you're safe now." The question that haunted them both remained unspoken. At what point does a father forfeit his right to that sacred title? When the blood tie becomes a chain? When protection turns to possession? When love twists into something unrecognizable? They found their answer, not in philosophy, but in daily acts of gentle courage. William taught Melia to ride and shoot, skills that transformed her from victim to survivor. She brought color back to his solitary existence, filling the cabin with wildflowers and laughter. Together they created something neither had dared hope for, a family built on choice rather than obligation. One night, as a fierce desert storm raged outside, Melia watched William rock Esperanza to sleep, his rough hands impossibly gentle with the child. "You know," she whispered, "sometimes I think this is what saved me. Not just escaping, but finding someone who showed me what real protection feels like." The rancher nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for more words. They had both learned that true family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's who stands beside you when the darkness comes. Their peace remained fragile, built from broken pieces and held together by quiet determination. Pain was not forgotten, but it no longer governed their days. And as the wind howled across the desert, their small light burned steadily in the vast darkness. Not just surviving, but living. In the harshest places, the strongest bonds are forged. And in each other, Amelia Hart and William Sousa had found not just sanctuary, but home.